welcome to this historic event. This weekend is quite special, and special to the Royal British Legion. And so welcome, and I hope you're going to have a wonderful evening. We've got a very hectic programme. I don't think it's been attempted before, and I'm not sure whether we will try again. But just to give you a little flavour of how this all came about 18 months ago, the government and the Royal British Legion, in their wisdom, decided to ask villagers that had a war memorial if they would like to consider putting an event on of some description to commemorate the start of World War I. Well, some bright spark came about and thought of involving all the schools, the scouts and guides in Burnham, and they took up the challenge. And I hope some of you have been able to see part of the exhibition that they've produced that are on the mezzanine floor and in this hall, and they've been working for the past 12 months doing this, and they've got it on their programme throughout the next 4 years. So it's a wonderful achievement for the village for them to take up that challenge. And to conclude the challenge was to have a concert, which you're all here to see. We've got everybody together. They are all volunteered their services. We've had a few headaches, we've had it like naturally, but we hope it's going to all come together. And without this, I couldn't have achieved this without Jackie, my wife, helping me and tirelessly working and getting the funding to create this evening and for the schools to be able to do their exhibition. So I thank you, Jackie, for that. And just as an aside, on the mannequin is a tunic there that's actually 100 years old. It was worn by a Corporal James Parson, and he wore it in the 1914 throughout the war, and that is a tribute. His son, who's over 90, allowed us to show that this evening, and so that's quite a proud moment for us. So enough of me, and let's hope here's the show. So may I introduce to you, to open our first portion of the evening, the Right Honourable Dominic Grieve, RMP. Thank you.
Well, good evening, and thank you very much for inviting me to take part in this commemoration. It is, I think, an interesting feature of what we are commemorating. But 100 years on, it still strikes such a deep chord. A deep chord in the way we operate, because we after all have Remembrance Sunday, which is directly derived from it, the poppies we wear on that occasion. And because the First World War, in a very different way from the Second World War, is deeply ingrained in national psyche as something quite exceptional for everybody in this country. In many ways, the bare statistics bear that out. In some ways, bare statistics is all that one can look at initially when one wants to consider it. It's hard to imagine what Burnham was like in 1914. I know some of you here write to me complaining about the disappearance of the Greenbelt, but I'm afraid a lot of green space has disappeared since 1914, and Burnham was probably then a rather sleepy little market town, with a little bit of industry on the edges, down at Lent Rise, where the developments had come with the railway cottages. And Slough didn't exist really at all, except for a small area around the station that had been rather pleasantly colonised by Victorian families wanting to get fresh air out of London. 3,715 people living in Burnham and Sydenham parishes, which were combined for civil parish purposes in the 1911 census. That gives you some idea of the scale and size of the place. And by early 1915, 270 men from here were in the armed forces, either because they would have been professional soldiers, I suspect a tiny number, or because they had volunteered. And by the end of that year, 420. And once conscription came in, more still. And as those of you who've been to look at the War Memorial will know, although it's possible that there are some names that are not on it that should be, there are 91 names of men from Burnham who did not return. So as I say, those are bare statistics, but it's difficult to get a feel of how that would have impacted on families in this community. And indeed, I can't this evening even start to do an analysis of that. But I can share with you a little bit about my own family experience, which I think may help set a bit of the scene. Firstly, and before I do that, I would just say one other thing which I think is quite important. We think of the First World War as the end of a great period of peace. Actually, the lead-up to the First World War was a period of massive social unrest and quite a lot of violence. In the 12 months before Britain went to war in 1914, 8 churches in this country were blown up by suffragettes. Blown up with explosives and destroyed, including a Norman church which was a great historic monument in Cheshire. I think in 1911-1912, 41 million days, working days, had been lost in strike action. And of course, in the immediate weeks before the First World War broke out, it looked as if the United Kingdom was about to have a civil war in Ireland. And a civil war, moreover, in which a section of the army was threatening to mutiny because they were refusing to enforce the Home Rule decision of Parliament against the Northern Ireland Unionists. And actually, I think one of the interesting things is that it's a society in Edwardian Britain, but throughout Europe. We sometimes complain, people write to me, that we're becoming a violent society. But actually, the society in the early 20th century had a very strong undercurrent of violence indeed. Violence for the late night punch-up in the pub, which would never come to the notice of the police, because it would be regarded as completely unnecessary or odd to do so. I suspect quite a lot of domestic violence, a lot of drunkenness as well. And in the language states use towards each other, and I'll come back to that in just a moment, quite a lot of language of violence, force, as something which is justified or even manly. Now, we live in a society which is rather different, and I sometimes think we have to work our way around that to understand the mindset of those who went to war in 1914. Which brings me to my own family. Now, I had 2 grandfathers and 2 great uncles who were involved in the First World War. And effectively, out of those 4, only one survived. One of my grandfathers, interestingly, was French. So although an ally, and indeed a career army officer, the history in my family that passed down to me is of his experiences until he was very seriously wounded at the end of 1915. And I have to say, it is remarkable, he was an amateur photographer. And when I was at home this afternoon, I dug out the file. And there are the most extraordinary photographs, starting with a photograph of him on horseback in a field in Lorraine in the middle of August 1914. Purely Napoleonic photo, with his regiment all in close order behind him in the cornfield. Beautiful weather, you can almost sense the beauty of the moment, and battle was about to be joined. In fact, the most murderous battles that ever took place in the First World War, more murderous even than the Battle of the somme, in terms of the wastage of human life as the armies collided for the first time just under 100 years ago, late August 1914. And then I've got the other photographs which follow the next 6-9 months, most of which show him with his head poking out of a hole. In the trenches with his men, in mud up to his waist. Fascinating photographs. He used to write cards to my grandmother, and the cards on the back saying, this is where he can't say where he is, but he says, I am in Champagne, he says, and the weather's foul, and this is our shelter, and here is this sort of tumble-down shack, which has been covered over with earth in order to provide them with protection. But he looks cheerful. And actually the cheerfulness, the extent to which people took what I think we would regard as being really appalling privations in their stride, is really one of the most remarkable features of this war. Now, of course, some people opposed the war, some people were conscientious objectors, but the images that come across when you're not looking at the corpses is actually of people who show tremendously high morale, and this seems to apply to all sides. Then my other grandfather, my British grandfather, he served in the Middlesex Regiment. Quite a few men from here served in as well. Very much a local recruiting regiment, northwest of London. And he was killed at the Battle of Ypres at Ypres. I don't think it was a battle going on, actually. It was February 1915. His second 36-hour tour in the trenches. And I have a description letter from his company sergeant written to my father in the 1950s, which describes the conditions they were in. The trenches weren't being dug, there were no communications trenches. The trenches were frozen and flooded. And he was killed when he climbed out to walk back to the company headquarters to find out information as to when the men would be relieved, because he was concerned about their condition after the second 36-hour period in it. Very vivid description of it. And then my two great uncles, well, one was killed in 1918 in the artillery, and the other one died after the war, but undoubtedly of its effects. I think he experienced great psychological trauma, and he was an army officer, career army officer. And those are the sorts of vignettes, but you get other ones too. I mean, I know my grandfather took his entire platoon. They got 48 hours leave before they left, and they all met up in London. He took them for tea at the Criterion, which in those days was a Trocadero. The Criterion and the Trocadero were all together, and you could go and get tea on Piccadilly Circus. They all had cream tea. And as I say, these people come across, and I think most tellingly, as cheerful in the adversity that they face. And of course, the generation that followed was equally marked. My father was a posthumous child. He was born 4 weeks after my grandfather died. He was killed. And that clearly marked him. I remember his telling me that as a boy, he used to fantasize that he would walk around the corner and find his father walking towards him. And that, I suspect, is a phenomenon that was very common and very current throughout the 1920s and 1930s. We have the strange rise, don't we, the spiritualism in the 1920s, when widows, mothers, all went to Ouija boards to try and communicate with their deceased children or husbands. I said at the beginning, it was a world where I think violence was much more accepted, or acceptable than it was today. It was a manly, military pursuit, was a manly one. And I think that was reflected in society. Of course, there have been lots of people who've said lots of things about who's to blame for the First World War. I don't think in the course of a few remarks this evening, I'm going to try and get to the bottom of that. There are plenty of books that are coming out which you can all read. But I do have my own views, because I've studied history at university, and I think things which one picks up. One thing's quite clear, all those men who went to war in 1914, Germans, Austro-Hungarians, Serbs, French, British, Belgians, all thought their cause was just. I have absolutely no doubt about it at all. The patriotic instinct that filled them was probably an absolute common currency. And each believed that the war was due to somebody else's fault. So perhaps we should avoid too much fault. But I don't think we can escape the conclusion, firstly, that Germany did seem to celebrate in the most extraordinary and reckless fashion the glorification of military might. And countries which do that, I think, and it's a lesson for us today when we look around the world, are, I think, a serious menace. Because ultimately, what you articulate in your words, you become more willing to do in your deeds, regardless of the consequences, even if you may have grievances which are justified. And the second one, and I do feel this very profoundly, although there's been much criticism of the United Kingdom as to the way it operated, suggested our generals were poor. I think actually some of them were very good. It was just that they were, like so many others, completely overtaken by events and the technology of war that had been thrust upon them. But I do think that ultimately we are entitled to feel proud of what the United Kingdom did. Of course there was an element of self-interest. From the United Kingdom's point of view, looking at the continent of Europe and seeing the prospect of the balance of power being permanently upset by a large war was a very serious threat to our national interests. I think actually probably outweighed the benefits of staying out. But on top of that, it was also quite clear that the threat to our national interests was being reflected in flagrant breaches of international law, including the invasion of Belgium, which is what finally triggered the decision of the United Kingdom to give its ultimatum to Germany. I find it difficult standing here. Until a couple of weeks ago, I was a rather frequent visitor to the cabinet room. It's quite strange to think of Asquith 100 years ago this morning having breakfast with the German ambassador and warning him that Britain would not remain neutral if Belgium was invaded. Or thinking of what would have been happening there tonight 100 years ago when members of the cabinet, because there was no other means of communication really, would drift in and would just sit round the cabinet table and talk and articulate what was going to happen the following day when Edward Graves stood up in the Commons to explain the British government's position and how it would not tolerate Belgium being violated, and led to the ultimatum being issued, which 24 hours later we will commemorate on the 4th by switching out our lights and lighting our candles. So there's the theme. I think it's the most tremendous thing that Burnham should have come together and organised this, and a huge tribute to the British Legion and all Royal British Legion and all the others who participated. And I'm quite sure that we will have an interesting, this entertainment, but also, I hope, a thought-provoking evening. Thank you very much.